Hi, this is Ron Cipcic. In this particular video, we're going to put the aggregate demand curve together with the aggregate supply curve, and we're going to do some AD.AS analysis. I assume that you've already watched the video over aggregate demand. I actually developed the aggregate demand curve in a separate video. I also take the time to develop the aggregate supply curve in a separate video. You'll note here that this aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, which indicates this is what we would call a short run aggregate supply curve. And notice this is the aggregate demand curve here, and it shows the relationship between the total level of spending and the price level. So aggregate demand actually equals C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M. So it looks at all of the spending related to the level of spending related to the price level. Now I assume that you already have these foundations, so I'm not going to relay them again. What we want to do in this particular video is talk about the properties of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve together. This is really a picture of the macroeconomy. It's really a picture of the macroeconomy. In other words, we're looking at all producers versus all buyers. Buyers being members of households, businesses, government, and we can even have foreign buyers. Of course, we're subtracting out M because we only want the aggregate demand for domestic output. Notice here that I've drawn the economy in equilibrium. If we're in equilibrium, we're in what we would call a steady state. So this price level is bringing about stability. What do you mean stability? Well, once we're in equilibrium, unless there's some shock to the system will sit at that level. It's what we would call a steady state. So YE is where YS equals YD. So real GDP supplied equals real GDP demanded, and that's what we mean by equilibrium real GDP. Now, if the output rate equals the rate of demand, then there is no unplanned inventory change. So there's no unplanned inventory accumulation. There's no unplanned inventory reduction. Inventory levels are at levels that are acceptable to business people. Well, if inventory levels are at the right level, businesses feel content with those inventory levels. They have no reason to increase production or decrease production, and we could say that Y, or real GDP, is at a steady state. So Y is at a steady state, and remember what Y is, it's real GDP, inflation adjusted GDP. Okay, so we start with this notion of equilibrium. Now let me quickly add that equilibrium, we don't talk about equilibrium because equilibrium is common. We talk about equilibrium because we're usually in disequilibrium moving towards equilibrium. So if we understand how the economy moves from disequilibrium towards equilibrium, we can actually make predictions about where the economy is going to go. So let me go ahead and erase these notes that I've put on here, and I want to take this a step further. Let me show you how we move from disequilibrium to equilibrium using this macroeconomic model. So I'm going to erase the orange here, and I'll go to let me go to a green here, and I'm going to bring up my ruler again, and we're going to do put some lines in here to help us out. So what if the price level is too high? What if the price level is above equilibrium? What would happen if prices are too high? You go, what do you mean by too high? They're always too high. No, they're not always too high. They're not always too high. In economics, too high means they're above equilibrium. They don't equilibrate. A price is too high if it's above equilibrium and it does not equilibrate the setting. So let's draw this in P high, and at P high, if you come out here to the aggregate supply curve, you see that real GDP supplied is way out here. So at high prices, producers want to produce more. And I talked about the wage lag effect and how price levels that are high often lead to real wages that are are quite low, which leads to an increase in labor demanded, which leads to an increase in real GDP supplied. Now, if you say, I don't have a clue what you're saying, you haven't watched the video on aggregate supply yet. So I explained that in the aggregate supply video. If the price level is high, households, businesses, government, and foreigners will not be as inclined to buy as much of this country's output, so real GDP demanded will be relatively low. The point is there will be a gap, and at P high, real GDP supplied is greater than real GDP demanded. You go, who cares? We do. Why? Because we're running what? We're running an unplanned inventory accumulation. In other words, inventory levels have risen unexpectedly. You go, who cares? We do, because we're studying the economy. If inventory levels have risen unexpectedly, what will happen? Prices and output will decrease. Now, earlier in the course, earlier in my video series, I talk about the expenditure line model, and we basically show all of this using the expenditure line model. What we ignore, though, are the price level changes. So what's new here is we're incorporating prices into the analysis. So the unplanned inventory accumulation will pull down the price level and will pull down the output rate and will push up real GDP demanded to equilibrium. And so we see that the economy moves from disequilibrium towards what? Towards equilibrium. And again, if we can understand that we're here, if we can look at inventory levels, survey business people, and business people are telling me, hey, our inventory levels are higher than expected, we've sold less than we intended to sell, our profits are lower than expected, well then we know this price level is too high and this output rate is too high, and the economy is going to be moving towards this equilibrium point. Okay? So economics is science. We try to learn how things are connected, and then based on our understanding of how things are connected, we try to make predictions about where things are going. Interesting. Interesting, interesting. Science by its very nature is not history. We study history, of course. We have to study history to know how things are related, how things have worked in the past. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop relationships, how things are connected, so we can make predictions about where things are going in the future. Okay, so let's do the flip side here. Let me very quickly get my ruler out again, and we're going to do the other side of this. We're not going to cheat you, so we'll go here and we'll go with a different color. Say the price level is too low. What's going to be the effect if the price level is too low? Let's take a look at this. There we go. I love that marker tool. I love that ruler tool. It's very, very cool. All right, P low, Y sub D, Y sub S. We've got just the opposite scenario here. If the price level is too low, it's not equilibrating the macroeconomy. And so what's got to happen? Well, at P low, what's going on? YD is greater than YS, which means what? Demand is greater than supply. We're running what? Unplanned inventory reductions. Unplanned inventory reductions, which means inventory levels are too low. Yeah, businesses carry inventory levels that they're comfortable with. Businesses that are producing goods want to have inventory on hand. They want to be able to meet unexpectedly high demand. And so when inventory levels fall too low because of unexpectedly high demand, business people are going to want to replenish those inventory levels. They're going to want to change their behavior and adjust to that. So what's likely going to happen here is prices will rise and real GDP supplied will rise. Okay, so when inventory levels are too low, when sales are too strong, when profits are very strong, it's likely you're going to see prices start to rise. And as prices begin to rise, real GDP supplied is going to rise. But as prices rise, real GDP demanded will actually decrease. And again, we move towards equilibrium. Okay? Now the beauty of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is it's starting to incorporate price level effects. The AD.AS model, incorporates both price level effects and real GDP, where the expenditure line model, basically holds the price level constant. It ignores prices and only looks at output. Okay? So that's one of the differences in the models. By the way, there's no one macroeconomic model that can describe all macroeconomic phenomenon. That's just not possible. So we use different models to describe different aspects of reality. Okay? So that's the way the game is played in science. Now, let's move on. What I'd like to do is talk about how a movement in the aggregate demand curve affects PE and QE. So it's to move PE and QE, PE and YE. YE is really a measure of Q, quantity, but it's a dollar measure. So movements in aggregate demand or movements in aggregate supply are going to be the causes of movements, ultimately the causes of movements in PE and YE. Okay? So let's look at this, and I'm gonna just to make this kind of interesting. I hope it's interesting. Is I'm going to actually tack some numbers on here. So this is, let's say this is a price level of 300. Remember, price levels at the macro level are not expressed in dollars. They're expressed in 100s, and these are index numbers. So an index number of 300 means that prices have gone up 3 times on average since the base year. Real output is expressed in dollars at the macro level. So let's say, for the sake of argument, this is 4,000. Okay? All right, now, I want to review something that I talked about in an earlier video. I hope you've watched this video. If you haven't, then you're going to be seeing this for the first time. If you take nominal GDP, you take nominal anything, but you take nominal GDP, divide it by the price level, you get real GDP in base year dollars. So we've learned way back when we talked about the price level in particular that any nominal amount can be converted to a real amount by dividing it by the price level. Nominal is in current dollars, real is in base year dollars. And remember, we want to get data into base year dollars so we can compare it over time. Real GDP is being abbreviated with a lowercase y. So this lowercase y down here is real GDP. So nominal divided by the price level equals real, which means the price level times real equals nominal GDP. So I'm going to reorient that formula, and I'm going to move that actually because I don't like that there. I'm going to move that a little bit over here. So the price level times y equals nominal GDP. Okay? Now, we've already got data here that can show that. So the price level we said is 300, which means prices have gone up 3 times since the base year. Real GDP is 4,000. So the 4,000 goes here, which means nominal GDP is 12,000, 3 times 4. So here's the interesting thing, and you probably haven't thought about this, but I'm going to introduce this so you do think about it. If you take the width of a rectangle, multiply it by the length of a rectangle, you get the area of a rectangle. So the width, here's a rectangle right down here. In fact, let me color it in. This orange rectangle right here. That rectangle represents nominal GDP. You go, how so? Well, the width of that is the price level. Here's the width of it. The length of it is real GDP, which means the area has to be nominal GDP. So the beauty of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the beauty of this model is that it shows how changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply affect price level, real GDP, and nominal GDP. Whereas the expenditure line model only shows how changes in spending affect GDP. It doesn't distinguish between real and nominal because it's holding the price level constant. Okay, so let me get my my tool out again here. I'm going to go up my ruler tool, and I'm going to make a shift in this aggregate demand curve. I'm going to shift it to the right, and I'm going to use a different color here. So we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and let me again put that in here. Let me get the dots in here so I can draw a nice picture here. So there's price level goes up. We'd expect that if the aggregate demand curve slides to the right. Okay, so if the aggregate demand curve slides to the right, say to AD2, say this is due to an increase in confidence, or this is due to an increase in wealth. Say the stock market is booming and people feel wealthier, or housing prices are rising and people feel wealthier, and because people feel wealthier they're more confident, and maybe interest rates have fallen, etc. Anything that motivates households, businesses, government, and foreigners to purchase more domestic output is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Well, that will initially create a what? Unplanned inventory reduction, right? Because this price level would be too what? This price level would be too low, right? If the price level is too low, aggregate demand is going to be greater than aggregate supply, and what's going to happen? The price level is going to go up to PE2, so say this is 360, and output's going to go up, let's say to 5,000. Just making the numbers up. Okay, so let me get my calculator out here and calculate the new, so 3.6 times 5,000 is 18,000. Nice even number, I like that. So the new price level is 3.60 times 5,000. This new number here is 18,000. So what we can see is we can see that the box got a lot larger. Why did the box get larger? It got wider and it got longer. It got wider and longer. And if a rectangle gets wider and longer, its area is going to increase, actually geometrically. So what's interesting here, let me get this out of the way right here. I need this space. So what's interesting here is if you look at the percentage change in this is actually a 20%, that's a 20% increase in the price level. 360 minus 300 divided by 300 would be a 20% increase. This is actually a 25% increase. And this is actually a 50% increase. So what this model shows, and what's really cool about this model, is it distills or breaks down the pieces which lead to an increase in the economy looking bigger. This economy looks 50% bigger. The question is why does it look 50% bigger? It's because we've produced 25% more output, and it's because prices have risen 20%. So a large part of this bigness is simply people paying more for the same thing. But the economy also produced more output. So it's producing more output and it's charging more for the output it produces. And these numbers don't add up because if you look at this, you really calculated, what you did here is you calculated, this is the 20% increase right here. This is the 20% increase right here. And then what you did is you showed the increase in price against a constant y. And then what we did is we showed an increase in y against a constant p. Okay, so this is the 25% increase in y, but this has been left out. Don't do this to your picture. You don't have to do this to your picture, but this has been left out. So this is the residual. This is the 5% that is not accounted for. And I'm trying to use simple math here. I don't want to use something called calculus. We could find that residual. We actually just found it, but we could actually compute the size of it if it were a funky number using some math. But we don't want to worry about this. So what I'm basically saying is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is a powerful way of showing how a change in spending, if you're talking about the demand side, or a change in output, if you're talking about the aggregate supply curve, how those factors affect the price level, how those factors affect real GDP, and how those factors affect nominal GDP. Okay? Well, I think we've run on long enough here, and that's probably enough for you to process in one lesson. So that concludes my discussion of aggregate demand and aggregate supply fundamentals. You could do the same analysis with a vertical aggregate supply curve. In fact, I do this in my workbook. I show you the same analysis using a vertical aggregate supply curve. It essentially leads to many of the same conclusions, so I will not bother to draw that for you. But hope you enjoyed this, hope this helped, and I hope to see you in one of my future videos.